disturbing. Tonight, we are plunging into the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains with some truly unsettling true horror stories that will keep you up all night, if you're brave enough. Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into fear. Now, get comfortable, relax. I teach 4th grade in suburban Maryland, which means I spend most of my days surrounded by the controlled chaos of 28 9-year-olds. By June, I'm ready to climb the walls. This year felt worse than usual. Maybe it was the divorce finally going through, or maybe it was just the accumulation of too many standardized tests and too many parent conferences where I had to explain why little Johnny wasn't reading at grade level while his mother scrolled through her phone. When school ended, I didn't hesitate. I'd been talking about hiking the Appalachian Trail for years, always finding excuses. This time I packed my gear, took a month of unpaid leave, and drove north to Virginia. Not the whole trail, I'm not that ambitious or foolish, but a good section through Shenandoah and beyond. 3 weeks of walking, sleeping under stars, and not having to explain to anyone why I needed to use the bathroom. The first week went exactly as I'd hoped. My legs remembered how to carry weight, my shoulders adjusted to the pack, and my mind began to quiet. I fell into the rhythm of the trail: wake at dawn, break camp, walk until evening, make camp, sleep. Simple. The other hikers I met were friendly enough, but I kept to myself mostly. This was about solitude. I was somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia when I noticed the path. It was my 10th day out, and I'd stopped for lunch at a rocky outcrop with a decent view of the valley below. While eating my trail mix and warm water, I spotted what looked like a faint trail leading off into the woods about 50 yards back from where I'd come. That struck me as odd. I'd passed that spot not 10 minutes earlier and hadn't seen anything. I pulled out my trail map and GPS unit. Both showed nothing but dense forest in that direction. The official trail continued straight ahead, following the ridgeline for another 6 miles before the next shelter. Curiosity won out over common sense. I'd always been the type to explore side streets and back alleys when traveling. What harm could there be in a quick look? The path was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual trail. Leaves had fallen across it, and in places it seemed to fade entirely before reappearing a few yards ahead. But it was definitely man-made, or at least worn by something walking regularly in that direction. The trees on either side had the scraped bark that comes from repeated passage. I told myself I'd follow it for just 15 minutes, then turn back. I marked the spot where I'd left the main trail by stacking 3 rocks in a small cairn. Then, I pushed through the understory and started walking. The forest felt different almost immediately. On the main trail, you could hear the sounds of life. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Here, everything seemed muffled. My footsteps sounded too loud, echoing off the trees in a way that didn't make sense in open forest. The trees themselves were strange. Most of the Appalachians I'd walked through were 2nd or 3rd growth forest, the original giants long since cut down and hauled away. But these trees were old, massive oaks and chestnuts that would have taken centuries to reach their size. Their trunks were twisted in ways that suggested they'd grown under stress, bending around obstacles that were no longer there. 10 minutes in, I realized the light was dimming. Not the gradual fade of approaching evening, but something more sudden. I checked my watch, 2:30 p.m. The sun should have been high and bright, but the canopy above me seemed to catch and hold the light, letting only thin shafts through to dapple the forest floor. I should have turned back then. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to retrace my steps to the main trail. But the path ahead curved invitingly around a massive oak, and I could see what looked like a clearing beyond, just a little further. The clearing turned out to be nothing special. A small open space where a tree had fallen years ago, now overgrown with ferns and mountain laurel. But as I stood there, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps. Careful, measured, steps coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see another hiker who'd followed my path. The forest was empty. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" I called out. My voice seemed to disappear into the trees without echo. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just the oppressive quiet that had been following me since I left the main trail. I waited another minute, listening. When I was satisfied I was alone, I continued forward. The path wound between the ancient trees, sometimes clear, sometimes nearly invisible. I had to stop frequently to make sure I was still following it and not just wandering randomly through the forest. That's when I started hearing the whispers. At first I thought it was just wind in the leaves, but there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy, like before a thunderstorm. The whispers were just at the edge of hearing. Not words I could make out, but definitely human voices. Multiple voices speaking softly to each other in a language I didn't recognize. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to hear better. The whispers stopped too. This was getting ridiculous. I was clearly letting my imagination run away with me. Too many nights alone in the woods. Too much Stephen King read by headlamp. I needed to get back to the main trail, back to reality. But when I turned around to retrace my steps, I couldn't find the path I'd been following. The forest looked the same in every direction. Ancient trees, thick undergrowth, no clear route back. I tried to remember which way I'd come, but the twists and turns had confused my sense of direction. I pulled out my GPS unit, but the screen showed nothing but static. No satellite signal. That was impossible. I'd had a clear signal on the main trail just an hour ago. Don't panic, I told myself. The Appalachian Trail is a major hiking route. Even if I'm lost, I can't be more than a few miles from civilization. I'll pick a direction and walk until I hit a road or a stream or something. I chose what I thought was north and started walking. The trees seemed to close in around me as I pushed through the undergrowth. Branches caught at my pack and clothes. The light continued to dim, though my watch still showed mid-afternoon. After 20 minutes of fighting through increasingly thick brush, I found myself back in the same clearing with the fallen tree. That was impossible. I'd been walking in a straight line, or as straight as the terrain allowed. There was no way I should have ended up back where I started. I tried, again, this time marking my path by breaking branches as I went. 15 minutes later, I was back in the clearing. The branches I'd broken were there, clearly showing the route I'd taken. But somehow that route had led me in a circle back to the same spot. The whispers started again, more insistent now. I could almost make out words, but they slipped away whenever I focused on them. And underneath the whispers, a new sound, a low humming, like distant chanting or the buzz of electrical equipment. I sat down on the fallen log and tried to think rationally. People got lost in the woods all the time. The key was not to panic, to conserve energy, to wait for rescue or find a way out systematically. But this felt different from being simply lost. This felt like being trapped. Movement caught my eye, a flash of dark clothing between the trees about 30 yards away. I stood up quickly, hope flaring. Another hiker, someone who could help me find my way back. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. "Over here!" The figure didn't respond. It seemed to be watching me, though I couldn't make out any details through the trees. Just a dark shape, roughly human-sized, standing perfectly still. "Can you help me?" I called again. "I'm lost." The figure moved then, but not toward me. It glided, that was the only word for it, from one tree to another, always keeping the same distance, always watching. I couldn't see a face, couldn't even be sure it was human, but I could feel its attention, like a weight on my skin. I started toward it, crashing through the underbrush, but it moved away, staying just at the edge of visibility. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved, always watching. The humming grew louder. Not mechanical, I realized, but vocal. Multiple voices humming in harmony, the sounds seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran then, abandoning any attempt to follow a path. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my pack catching on every protruding branch. Behind me, I could hear footsteps keeping pace, not hurried, not running, just the steady, measured tread of someone walking at exactly my speed. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then collapsed against a tree, gasping. The forest around me was completely unfamiliar. These weren't even the same species of trees I'd been seeing. The bark was smooth and pale, almost white, and the leaves were the wrong shape for anything I knew grew in these mountains. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped. The humming continued, a constant background drone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I checked my watch. 2:30 p.m. The same time it had been when I first noticed the light dimming. Either my watch had stopped, or time wasn't moving normally here. That thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange calm descending. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe the stress of the divorce and the job and everything else had finally caught up with me, and I was hallucinating all of this. That would explain the impossible geometry, the figure in the trees, the sense that the forest was watching me. I sat there against the pale tree and tried to remember how I'd gotten here. The details seemed fuzzy. I remembered leaving the main trail, but I couldn't quite recall why. Something about curiosity, about exploring, but that seemed like something that had happened to someone else, a memory I was viewing from outside. The humming changed, became more complex. Harmonies within. Harmonies, voices weaving in and out of each other in patterns that hurt to follow, and underneath it all, another sound. My own voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. I wasn't speaking, my mouth wasn't moving, but I could hear myself clearly, my voice joining the chorus, saying things in that strange language that nonetheless felt familiar on my tongue. I stood up abruptly, breaking whatever spell had been settling over me. This was real. This was happening. And I needed to get out of here before whatever was wrong with this place consumed me completely. I picked a direction at random and started walking again, but more carefully this time. I tried to stay aware of my surroundings, to notice landmarks that might help me navigate. The pale trees gave way to more familiar oaks and maples, but the silence persisted. No birds, no insects, no wind, just my footsteps and the distant humming. After what felt like hours but registered as no time at all on my motionless watch, I saw something through the trees ahead. A structure of some kind, made of stone. My heart leaped. A building meant people, meant a way out of this nightmare. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a building. It was some kind of circle, maybe 20 feet across, made of standing stones arranged in a perfect ring. The stones were covered with carved symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly. In the center of the circle was an altar, a flat stone slab supported by 4 smaller stones. Dark stains covered its surface, stains that looked disturbingly like old blood. I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from that place. But I found myself drawn forward, pulled by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The humming was louder here, the voices clearer. I could almost understand what they were saying. I stepped between 2 of the standing stones into the circle. The world exploded into sensation. The humming became a roar. The whispers became screams, and the dim forest light blazed into something that burned my eyes. I fell to my knees on the packed earth inside the circle, hands pressed to my ears, but the sound was coming from inside my skull. Images flashed through my mind, memories that weren't mine, experiences I'd never had. I saw myself standing in this circle before, but I was different, older, younger, sometimes not myself at all, but other people, other times. I saw the stones being raised, the first sacrifice made on the altar, centuries of pilgrims and victims drawn to this place. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through my panic, that I had been here before. Not in this life, but in others. This place existed outside normal time and space, drawing people to it across centuries. The path I'd followed wasn't random. It was the same path everyone followed, the only path that led here. The figure I'd seen watching me stepped into the circle. Up close, I could see it was myself. Not exactly, but close enough. The same face, but marked by experiences I hadn't had. It smiled with my mouth and spoke with my voice. "Welcome back," it said. "You've been gone longer than usual this time." I tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but no sound came out. The other me nodded as if I'd answered. "You never remember at first," it said. "But you will. You always do. That's why you keep coming back, even when you try to forget." The world spun around me, the stone circle blurring into streaks of gray. When it stopped, I was lying on the forest floor outside the ring, and the sun was setting. My watch showed 7:30 p.m., 5 hours since I'd first left the main trail. The other me was gone. The circle was gone. I was lying in an ordinary clearing surrounded by ordinary trees, and I could hear ordinary forest sounds, an owl calling, something small rustling in the leaves. I got to my feet shaking. My pack was beside me, my water bottle half empty. I felt like I'd been walking for hours, but I couldn't remember most of it. Just fragments, the pale trees, the whispers, the stone circle that might have been a dream. The path back to the main trail was clearly visible, marked by my own footprints in the soft earth. I followed it in the gathering dusk, and 10 minutes later I was back at the rocky outcrop where I'd stopped for lunch. My cairn of 3 stones was still there, exactly as I'd left it. I didn't stop to think about it. I packed up and hiked until full dark, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd experienced in those woods. I made camp at the next shelter, grateful for the company of 2 other hikers who were already settled there for the night. They asked where I'd been. Apparently I looked pretty rough. I told them I'd taken a wrong turn and gotten briefly lost. They accepted this without question. Hikers get lost all the time. But I knew it had been more than that. The memory was already fading, becoming dreamlike and unreal, but certain details remained sharp. The feeling of being watched, the sound of my own voice speaking words I didn't know, the certainty that I had been in that place before. I finished my hike 3 days later and drove home to Maryland, back to my empty apartment and my stack of summer reading for next year's curriculum. I threw myself into preparation for the new school year, stayed busy, tried not to think about what had happened in the woods. But the dream started almost immediately. Every night I found myself walking that faint path deeper into the forest. Every night I stood in the stone circle and spoke with the other version of myself. And every morning I woke with the absolute conviction that I needed to go back. The feeling got stronger as the weeks passed. I found myself researching the area where I'd hiked, looking at maps and satellite photos, trying to locate the exact spot where I'd left the main trail. I started planning another trip, telling myself it was just to prove that the whole experience had been stress-induced hallucination. But I knew better. Whatever was in those woods, whatever that place was, it had marked me, changed me. I could feel it calling, a constant pull southward, back to the mountains, back to the unmarked path that led to answers I wasn't sure I wanted to know. School started, and I tried to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of lesson plans and parent conferences. But my students noticed something different about me. I was distracted, distant. I found myself staring out the classroom windows at the trees beyond the playground, wondering what paths might be hidden in their shadows. The dreams intensified. They were so vivid now that I often woke unsure whether I was in my bed or still standing in that stone circle. Sometimes I could swear I heard the humming even during the day, a background drone just below the threshold of normal hearing. 3 weeks into the school year, I called in sick and drove south. I told myself I was just going to hike the same section of trail again, to prove to myself that there was nothing supernatural about what I'd experienced. Just a teacher having a midlife crisis, seeing patterns where none existed. But when I reached the rocky outcrop where I'd stopped for lunch that day, I didn't hesitate. The cairn of stones was gone. Other hikers had probably scattered them, but I knew exactly where to look. The faint path was there, barely visible among the trees, waiting for me. This time I didn't mark the spot where I left the main trail. This time I knew I wouldn't be coming back the same way. As I write this, I'm sitting in that stone circle, using the last of my phone's battery to record what I can remember. The symbols on the stones are glowing faintly in the darkness, and the humming has started again. The other me is here too, sitting across from me with patient eyes. Ready to remember? It asks. I think I am. I think I've been ready for a long time, maybe for lifetimes. The teacher part of me, the part that needs everything to make rational sense, is still fighting it. But that part is getting smaller, quieter. The truth is, I never left this place. Part of me has been here all along, in this space outside of time, waiting for the rest of me to catch up. The life I remember, the marriage, the divorce, the classroom full of 9-year-olds. Those are just dreams I have when I try to leave. This is where I belong. This is where I've always belonged. The battery is dying now, and the humming is getting louder. When you find this phone, and someone will eventually, because someone always does, don't try to follow the path that led me here. Don't look for the stone circle or the ancient trees. But if you do find yourself on a faint trail that doesn't appear on any map, if you hear whispers in a language you almost understand, if you see a figure watching you from between the trees, remember that some places exist outside the normal world. Some places call to certain people across time and space, drawing them back again and again until they finally stop fighting and come home. I can see myself clearly now, all the versions of myself that have stood in this circle over the centuries, teachers and farmers, soldiers and merchants, all of us drawn by the same pull, all of us trying to understand what this place is and why we keep returning to it. The answer is simple. This is where we began, and this is where we return. The stone circle is older than the mountains, older than the forests. It's a doorway, a crossing point between what is and what could be. And we are its guardians, its eternal visitors, its dreams made flesh. The humming has become music now, harmonies within harmonies, and I can hear my voice joining the chorus. This time I understand the words. This time I remember why I came. Welcome back, the stones whisper. You've been away too long. And they're right. I have been away too long, lost in dreams of suburban classrooms and ordinary life. But I'm home now, in the place that exists between moments, between breaths, between the beats of a heart that has been waiting centuries for me to return. The phone is dying, the screen flickering. Soon there will be nothing left but the circle, and the stones and the endless song that binds this place together. And I will be part of it, as I always have been, as I always will be. If you're reading this, it means you found the path too. It means the circle is calling you home. Don't fight it. Don't try to leave. You've been away too long too. I don't expect you to believe me, but here's what happened. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of gray dawn that makes you want to pull the covers over your head and pretend the world doesn't exist. I'd been having one of those weeks at work. You know the kind. My supervisor breathing down my neck about deadlines, 3 different projects falling apart at once, and a presentation that went so badly I wanted to crawl under my desk and never come out. By Monday night, I was lying awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the things I'd screwed up and all the ways I was going to screw up tomorrow. That's when I decided I needed to get out, away from the office, away from the city, away from people entirely. I'd hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail before, usually on weekends with friends, but this time I wanted to go alone. I needed the quiet. I picked a stretch in western Maryland I'd done once before, about 2 years ago. It wasn't one of the popular sections, no waterfalls or scenic overlooks that draw the Instagram crowd. Just woods and rocks and the kind of solitude that lets you think clearly for the first time in weeks. I figured I'd start early, hike for a few hours, and be back home by noon with my head screwed on straight. I left my apartment at 5:30 in the morning, drove for about an hour and a half through increasingly rural roads until I reached the small parking area where the trail crossed Route 40. There were only 2 other cars there, which was exactly what I wanted. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the sky was that flat gray color that promises rain later, but holds off just long enough to let you get where you're going. I shouldered my day pack, just water, some energy bars, and a first aid kit, and started up the trail. The path was covered with wet leaves that squelched under my boots, and the trees on either side were mostly bare, except for a few stubborn oaks still clinging to their brown foliage. Everything smelled like decay and dampness, that rich, earthy smell of a forest settling into winter. For the first hour, it was perfect. My mind started to unwind as my legs found their rhythm. The trail climbed steadily but not steeply, winding, through stands of maple and oak with the occasional pine mixed in. I passed one other hiker coming down, a middle-aged man with a gray beard who nodded and said good morning. After that, I had the woods to myself. That's when I first saw him. I was maybe 2 miles in, taking a short break to drink some water, when I noticed someone standing in the trees off to my left, maybe 50 yards away, just barely visible through the bare branches. A man, I thought, though at that distance it was hard to tell much about him except that he was wearing dark clothes and standing very still. I raised my hand in a casual wave, the way hikers do when they see each other, but he didn't respond. Didn't move at all, actually. I figured maybe he hadn't seen me, or maybe he was one of those antisocial types who come to the woods specifically to avoid human contact. Fair enough. I capped my water bottle and kept walking. 20 minutes later, I saw him again. This time I was climbing a particularly steep section, my breath coming in short puffs, when I looked up and saw the same figure standing in the woods ahead of me and to the right. Same dark clothes, same perfectly still posture. I stopped walking and stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Had he taken some side trail that paralleled the main path? Was he following me? I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet woods, too loud and too sharp. The figure didn't respond, didn't even turn toward me. He just stood there like a mannequin someone had placed between the trees. A little thread of unease started to work its way into my chest, but I pushed it down. There were probably any number of explanations. Maybe it wasn't even the same person. Maybe this guy was having some kind of medical emergency and needed help. I left the trail and started walking toward him, pushing through the underbrush and stepping over fallen logs. But when I got to where he'd been standing, there was no one there. I looked around, turning in a full circle. The forest floor was covered with leaves, but I couldn't see any obvious footprints or disturbed vegetation to show which way he might have gone. The trees were spaced far enough apart that I should have been able to see someone walking away, even at a distance. But there was nothing. Just me and the quiet woods and the sound of my own breathing. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening. No footsteps, no rustling branches, no sound of someone moving through the forest. The silence was so complete, it made my ears ring. Finally, I walked back to the trail and kept going. But that thread of unease had gotten stronger. It sat in my stomach like a cold stone. The trail leveled out for a while after that, following a ridgeline through stands of tall pines. The canopy was thicker here, blocking out most of the gray sky and making the woods feel darker and more enclosed. My footsteps were muffled by a carpet of pine needles, and the air smelled sharp and resinous. I tried to focus on the hiking, on the rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I'd stop and look back, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. Just the empty trail disappearing around a bend. Then I saw him again. I'd been walking for maybe another half hour when the trail took a sharp turn to the left. As I came around the bend, there he was, standing maybe 30 yards ahead of me, right next to the trail this time. Close enough that I could make out more details, though what I saw didn't make me feel any better. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or coat. His face was pale, almost white, and he was standing with his arms at his sides in a way that looked stiff and unnatural. Like he was a soldier at attention, except soldiers don't stand that still. Soldiers breathe. Soldiers blink. This guy looked like he'd been carved out of wood. "Hey!" I called out louder this time. "Are you okay?" Nothing. He didn't even seem to hear me. I started walking toward him, my heart beginning to hammer in my chest. And that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at anything. His head was tilted slightly upward, as if he was staring at something in the trees above the trail. But his eyes, I couldn't see his eyes clearly from that distance. But there was something wrong with the way he was looking. Or not looking. I got within maybe 10 yards of him before I stopped. Up close, I could see that his skin wasn't just pale, it was gray. Not the gray of someone who was sick or cold, but the flat, lifeless gray of concrete. And his clothes weren't just dark, They were black, but not the black of fabric. More like the black of empty space. "Sir," I said, and my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. He turned his head toward me. That's when I ran. I don't remember making the decision. 1 second I was standing there trying to figure out what was wrong with this person, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, scrambling downhill as fast as I could move. Branches whipped at my face and I could hear myself breathing in short, panicked gasps, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran before I looked back. When I finally did, there was no one behind me. I was standing in a small clearing maybe 100 yards from the trail, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What the hell was wrong with me? I'd just run away from someone who probably needed help, someone who might have been having a stroke or some kind of mental episode. I felt stupid and ashamed and still absolutely terrified, which made no sense at all. I found my way back to the trail and stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and go back to my car, but bigger part of me, the part that was embarrassed about panicking like a child, insisted that I keep going. I'd planned a 4-hour hike and I wasn't going to let some weird encounter scare me off. So I kept walking. The trail continued along the ridge for another mile or so before beginning a long descent toward a creek valley. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe the guy had been wearing some kind of costume. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, though that seemed like a lot of effort for a joke no one would ever hear about. Maybe I'd been more stressed than I thought, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew what I'd seen, and I couldn't shake the memory of the way he'd turned his head toward me at the end, smooth and deliberate, like a security camera swiveling to track movement. The descent was steep and rocky, requiring most of my attention, to avoid twisting an ankle. By the time I reached the bottom, I was feeling a little better. Physical exertion has a way of burning off anxiety, and the sound of running water was soothing after the oppressive quiet of the ridge. I followed the trail as it paralleled the creek for a while, then crossed a small wooden bridge and started climbing again. That's when I realized I was lost. Not lost exactly. I was still on the trail, and the trail would eventually lead me back to where I'd started. But I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. The section I'd hiked 2 years ago had included a long stretch along a creek, but this didn't look like the same creek. The bridge was newer, and the trees were different. More pines, fewer hardwoods. I stopped and pulled out the trail map I'd printed from the internet. According to the map, there should have been a side trail branching off to the left about a mile back, leading to a small waterfall. I hadn't seen any side trail. Either I'd missed it somehow, or I was on a different section of the AT than I thought. I was standing there studying the map when I heard a branch crack behind me. I spun around, and there he was again, maybe 20 feet away this time, standing in the middle of the trail like he'd materialized out of thin air. The same gray face, the same black clothes, the same unnaturally still posture. But this time he was looking directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His eyes, I could see them clearly now, were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like someone had filled the sockets with ink. And his mouth was open slightly, just enough to show darkness inside, as if there was nothing behind his lips but empty space. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then he took a step toward me. I've never heard anyone walk without making sound before. His foot came down on the trail. I saw it happen, but there was no crunch of leaves, no scrape of sole against stone, nothing. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned off. He took another step and another. Still no sound. I wanted to run again, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. All I could do was stand there and watch as he got closer, his black eyes fixed on mine, his mouth opening a little wider with each step. When he was maybe 10 feet away, I finally found my voice. "Stay back," I said, and it came out as a croak. "I'm warning you, stay back." He stopped, tilted his head to one side like a curious dog. Then he smiled. I can't describe that smile. It was too wide for one thing, stretching from ear to ear in a way that should have split his face open. And there were too many teeth. All of them sharp and white and perfectly straight. But worst of all was the way it never touched his eyes. Those black, empty eyes just kept staring at me with no expression at all, while his mouth twisted into something that might have been meant to look friendly but instead looked like a predator showing its fangs. That's when I ran again. But this time I didn't crash blindly through the woods. This time I ran down the trail, back the way I'd come, as fast as my legs could carry me. I don't know how far I got before I looked back. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe more. The trail was empty behind me. I stopped and bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what was happening to me. There were only two possibilities. Either I was having some kind of mental breakdown, seeing things that weren't there, imagining impossible encounters with things that couldn't exist, or something was seriously wrong with this place. Neither option was particularly comforting. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual in these mountains, but it still made me feel more isolated and vulnerable. I was on my own, at least until I could get back to my car and drive somewhere with cell coverage. I started walking again, moving as quickly as I could while still being careful not to trip on the rocky trail. The woods seemed different now, more threatening. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding something. Every sound, the drip of condensation from branches, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, made me jump. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I realized I was being followed. Not by the figure in black clothes. This was something different. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, just barely audible, matching my pace exactly. When I walked fast, they walked fast. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I stopped to listen, they stopped too. I turned around several times, but the trail behind me was always empty. Just gray woods and wet leaves and the fading echo of my own footsteps. But as soon as I started walking again, I'd hear them. Step, 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 keeping perfect time with my own movements like an audio delay. It took me a while to work up the courage to try an experiment. I was crossing a small stream on a series of stepping stones when I deliberately changed my rhythm, taking 2 quick steps followed by a longer pause. The footsteps behind me did the same thing. 2 quick steps, then silence. My hands started shaking again. I was being followed by something that could perfectly mimic my movements but had no physical presence I could detect. Something that was playing games with me. I broke into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind me sped up too, but they weren't quite in sync anymore. Sometimes they seemed to be gaining on me, and sometimes they fell behind, but they never stopped. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like rubber, and still I could hear them behind me, relentless and impossible. When I finally had to stop, doubled over and gasping for air, the footsteps stopped too. The woods around me were dead quiet except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there for several minutes, listening and looking back down the trail, but there was nothing to see or hear. I was starting to think I might actually be losing my mind when I saw him again. This time he was ahead of me, maybe 50 yards up the trail, standing right in the middle of the path. The same figure, but something was different about him now. He looked taller somehow, and his clothes weren't just black anymore. They seemed to absorb light, creating a hole in the landscape where he stood. I stopped walking and we stared at each other across the distance. Even from that far away, I could see his too wide smile, could feel those empty black eyes boring into me. My skin crawled with the certainty that he wasn't human, had never been human, despite his roughly human shape. Then he started walking toward me. Not the soundless movement from before. This time I could hear his footsteps clearly. But they were wrong, all wrong. Instead of the irregular rhythm of someone walking on uneven ground, his steps were perfectly metronomic. Click, 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 like a machine designed to imitate walking but programmed by someone who'd never actually seen a person walk. And he was moving too fast, not running, still maintaining that stiff, unnatural posture, but covering ground at a pace that should have been impossible. He was 50 yards away, then 40, then 30, and I still hadn't moved. When he was close enough that I could see the details of his face, the waxy texture of his gray skin, the way his black eyes reflected no light at all, the fact that his smile never wavered or changed, I finally broke free of whatever paralysis had been holding me and ran. But this time, running wasn't enough. I could hear him behind me, those mechanical footsteps getting closer with every second. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him maybe 20 feet back, still walking but somehow keeping pace with my desperate sprint. His head was tilted at an odd angle, like a bird studying an interesting insect, and that horrible smile never left his face. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs without slowing down. My lungs were on fire and there was a sharp pain in my side, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, those clockwork footsteps kept their steady rhythm, never getting closer but never falling behind either. The trail took a sharp turn to the right, and as I came around the bend, I saw something that made my heart sink. The figure was standing directly ahead of me, maybe 30 feet away, in exactly the same position as before. Same gray skin, same black clothes, same impossible smile. But I could still hear footsteps behind me. I skidded to a stop and spun around. There was another figure walking toward me from the direction I'd just come, identical to the first in every detail, and beyond. Him, barely visible through the trees, I could see a third figure standing motionless in the woods. They had me surrounded. I looked around frantically, trying to find some way off the trail, some route through the woods that might lead me back to safety. But the forest on both sides was thick with undergrowth and fallen trees, and I could see more figures now, standing, silent and still between the tree trunks like a crowd of witnesses waiting for something to begin. The figure ahead of me started walking again, and the one behind me resumed his mechanical pace. They were going to meet somewhere in the middle, and I was going to be caught between them. That's when I noticed something that probably saved my life. Off to my left, almost hidden by a tangle of dead vines, there was a narrow path leading downhill away from the main trail. It looked like it might have been a deer trail, or maybe an old route that had been abandoned when the main trail was rerouted. Either way, it was my only chance. I plunged into the underbrush and followed the path as it wound steeply downhill through thick stands of mountain laurel and rhododendron. Behind me, I could hear nothing. The footsteps had stopped, and the woods were quiet again. But somehow that silence was more terrifying than any sound would have been. The path was treacherous, slick with wet leaves and broken by fallen branches. But I didn't dare slow down. I half ran, half slid down the slope, using trees to catch myself when my feet went out from under me. My hands were scraped and bleeding from grabbing at rough bark, and my jeans were torn at the knees, but I kept going. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, the path leveled out and I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. On the far side, I could see a gravel road through the trees. A road meant cars, cars meant people, and people meant safety. I crashed through the last of the underbrush and stumbled onto the road, then turned left and started walking as fast as I could. My legs were shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had no idea where I was or how far I was from my car, but I knew I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd encountered in those woods. I'd been walking on the road for maybe 10 minutes when I heard a car approaching from behind. I turned and waved frantically, and an old pickup truck pulled over. The driver was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "You okay, miss?" he asked, looking concerned. "You look like you've been through hell." I must have looked pretty rough. My clothes were torn and dirty, my hands were bleeding, and I was probably pale as a sheet. But I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. "I got lost on the hiking trail," I said. "Can you tell me how to get back to Route 40? He gave me directions. I was about 3 miles from where I'd parked, he said, and offered to drive me there. I gratefully accepted. As we drove, he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, clearly worried, but he didn't ask any more questions. When we reached the parking area, my car was still there, looking normal and ordinary and wonderfully real. I thanked the man profusely and climbed into the driver's seat, then sat there for several minutes with the doors locked, trying to process what had happened. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Or had the stress of the past week finally caught up with me in the form of a complete psychological breakdown? Either explanation seemed equally unlikely, but one of them had to be true. I drove home, in a daze, jumping at every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and anxiety. The key: mind can play terrible tricks when it's under pressure, and mine had certainly been under pressure lately. But that night I dreamed about him. In the dream, I was back on the trail, but this time I wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing silent and still among the trees as far as I could see, all with the same gray skin and black eyes and impossible smiles, all watching me with patient, predatory interest. And in the center of them all, closest to the trail, was the original figure. But in the dream, I could see him clearly, could make out details that had been obscured by distance and terror during the actual encounter. His skin wasn't just gray. It was marked with intricate patterns, like tattoos or scars, that seemed to shift and crawl when I looked directly at them. His clothes weren't clothes at all, but something that looked like liquid shadow given form. And his eyes weren't empty black voids. They were full of something dark and hungry and utterly alien. He spoke to me in the dream, though his lips didn't move and I heard no sound. The words simply appeared in my mind, cold and clear and terrible. "We've been waiting for you," he said. "We've been waiting for such a long time." I woke up screaming. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to the woods since, haven't even driven on roads that might take me near the mountains. I tell myself it was all in my mind, a stress-induced episode that seems real in memory but has no basis in reality. But sometimes when I'm walking to my car after work or waiting for the bus on a dark street corner, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A tall, thin figure standing motionless in the shadows, watching me with black eyes and wearing that terrible smile. When I turn to look directly, there's never anyone there. Just empty sidewalks and ordinary shadows and the normal sounds of the city at night. But I know what I saw, just like I know what I saw on that trail 3 weeks ago. They're still out there, waiting in the spaces between the trees, in the places where people don't usually go. And sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I wonder if they're waiting for me specifically, or if they're waiting for anyone foolish enough to walk alone in the woods. I don't expect you to believe me. I'm not sure I believe me. But I know what happened, and I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that don't follow the rules we think we understand. And I know that the next time I see that figure, because I'm certain there will be a next time, I won't be able to run fast enough to get away. The woods remember everything, and they never forget a face.